Was trench warfare a necessary evil or a human disaster? At dawn, the battlefield is silent. Not peaceful, never peaceful, but suspended. A gray mist clings low to the earth, pooling inside long scars carved into the soil. These scars stretch for miles, bending and twisting across fields that were once green, once fertile, once alive. Now they are trenches. And inside them men wait. They have been waiting for hours. Some for days. Some for years. The year is 1915. Europe is at war, but not the war anyone imagined. When the first declarations were signed in the summer of 1914, generals spoke confidently of swift offensives, decisive maneuvers, and glorious breakthroughs. Politicians promised their citizens victory before the leaves fell from the trees. Soldiers marched to the front believing they would be home by Christmas. None of them foresaw this. A war without movement. A war without clear victories. A war measured not in miles gained but in bodies lost. From the North Sea to the Swiss border, a continuous line of trenches cuts through Belgium and France. Opposing armies stare at one another across a desolate strip of land known as no man's land, ground so lethal that crossing it often means certain death. Artillery shells churn the soil into mud. Barbed wire tangles anything that touches it. Machine guns wait, unmoving, patient, merciless. This is trench warfare. For 4 years, it will define the Western Front of the First World War. It will shape strategies, break armies, and destroy an entire generation. More than a military system, it becomes a way of life, a brutal, claustrophobic existence lived underground, under constant threat, under unrelenting pressure. And yet, trench warfare did not emerge from cruelty alone. It was not designed as an instrument of suffering. It was born from necessity. From technology advancing faster than tactics. From armies colliding with realities they did not understand and could not escape. The central question remains, more than a century later. Was trench warfare an unavoidable response to modern firepower? Or was it one of the greatest human disasters ever engineered by military doctrine? To answer this, one must go back before the trenches filled with water, before the rats and gas attacks and endless bombardments. One must return to a world on the brink, where confidence outweighed caution, and where war was still imagined as a contest of movement and maneuver. In 1914, Europe stood at the height of its power. Empires dominated the globe. Industrial capacity was unmatched in human history. Railways connected capitals. Factories produced weapons at unprecedented speed. Armies were larger, better trained, and more heavily armed than ever before. But they were also trapped by old assumptions. Military thinking was still shaped by the wars of the 19th century, conflicts where speed, cavalry charges, and bold offensives had decided outcomes. The belief was simple and deeply ingrained. Attack was superior to defense. Morale and courage, it was said, could overcome any obstacle. What commanders underestimated was the revolution already underway. By 1914, the machine gun had matured into a reliable, devastating weapon capable of firing hundreds of rounds per minute. Modern artillery could strike targets miles away with terrifying accuracy. Rifles were faster, deadlier, and more precise. Defensive firepower had eclipsed offensive mobility. Yet doctrine had not caught up. When war erupted in August, armies surged forward according to rigid plans. Germany launched its massive sweep through Belgium. France hurled its troops toward Alsace-Lorraine. Britain rushed to support its allies. Everywhere, soldiers advanced in dense formations, flags raised, officers leading from the front. They were cut down. Within weeks, casualties reached numbers previously unimaginable. Entire units vanished in hours. Advances stalled not because of lack of courage, but because firepower made movement suicidal. When troops dug in, at first temporarily then permanently, they discovered something unexpected. The ground protected them. A shallow trench reduced casualties. A deeper one saved lives. A reinforced position could stop an entire attack. Slowly, almost unconsciously, armies on both sides began to burrow into the earth. By the end of 1914, the Western Front had frozen. What followed was not a single trench, but a complex system. Frontline trenches, support trenches, reserve trenches, communication trenches connecting them all. Dugouts carved into walls. Sandbags stacked high. Firing steps cut into the earth. Everything designed for survival. Above ground lay death. Below ground lay endurance. This transformation shocked the world. Newspapers struggled to explain why the war was not progressing. Governments censored the truth. Families at home could not comprehend why millions of men were locked in place, living in mud, advancing only yards at the cost of thousands of lives. Yet from a military perspective, trench warfare offered grim logic. Defensive positions dramatically reduced losses, at least for those holding them. Artillery could break attacks before they reached the trenches. Machine guns turned no man's land into a killing field. Any commander who abandoned trenches without overwhelming advantage risked annihilation. To stay above ground was to die. To dig was to live. But survival came at a price. Life in the trenches was not merely dangerous, it was corrosive. Constant dampness rotted feet. Lice infested clothing. Rats fed on the dead. Shellfire never truly stopped, eroding nerves day after day, night after night. Sleep came in fragments. Fear became routine. And still, the war demanded offensives. High command could not accept permanent stalemate. Political pressure demanded action. Allies demanded progress. And so, again and again, men were ordered out of the trenches, across open ground, toward fortified positions bristling with weapons. They advanced knowing the odds. They advanced knowing many would not return. From the Battle of the Somme to Verdun, from Ypres to Passchendaele, trench warfare reached its most lethal expression. Each battle promised breakthrough. Each ended with marginal gains and catastrophic losses. Yet even in this apparent madness there was method. Trench warfare was not static by choice alone, it was imposed by reality. No army possessed, at least initially, the tools required to restore mobility. Tanks were experimental. Aircraft were primitive. Communications were slow and unreliable. Coordination across massive fronts was nearly impossible. In this environment, trenches became both shield and prison. They preserved armies from total destruction, while simultaneously trapping them in a cycle of attrition. Victory was no longer about swift conquest. It became a contest of endurance, of industry, manpower, and morale. Entire societies were pulled into this logic. Factories worked endlessly. Civilians rationed food. Nations reorganized their economies for a war that showed no sign of ending. The trenches were only the visible edge of a total war consuming everything behind the lines. And the men inside them understood this truth more clearly than anyone. They were not fighting for glory. They were surviving for the next hour, the next bombardment, the next order. Their world was reduced to mud walls, the sound of incoming shells, and the knowledge that one mistake, one exposed head, one misstep, could end everything. As the war dragged on, trench warfare became the defining symbol of industrialized slaughter. To understand why trench warfare emerged, one must first understand the world that walked blindly into it. In the decades before 1914, Europe had not been preparing for peace. It had been preparing, methodically, confidently, for war. Beneath diplomatic courtesies and royal family ties, a relentless competition was unfolding. Industrial power, imperial ambition, and national pride were reshaping the continent into an armed camp. Every major power believed conflict was inevitable. The only uncertainty was when it would begin, and who would strike first. Germany, newly unified and rapidly industrializing, sought its place among the world's great empires. France, still haunted by defeat in 1871, longed for security and revenge. Britain guarded its global dominance and naval supremacy. Austria-Hungary struggled to hold together a fragile, multi-ethnic empire. Russia mobilized vast manpower while lagging behind in modernization. Each nation armed itself accordingly. By the early 20th century, Europe possessed the most lethal military machinery ever assembled. Conscription systems produced millions of trained soldiers. Railways allowed rapid mobilization and deployment. Factories turned out rifles, shells, and guns in quantities unimaginable only a generation earlier. Yet military thinking lagged dangerously behind military technology. Generals were educated in a tradition that glorified the offensive. The decisive battle, where bold maneuver and aggressive spirit shattered the enemy, remained the ideal. Defensive warfare was seen as passive, even cowardly. Digging in was something armies did temporarily, never permanently. This belief was not irrational. It was rooted in experience. The wars of the 19th century, Prussia's victories over Austria and France, the campaigns of Napoleon, had been won through movement and concentration of force. Speed and initiative had overwhelmed slower opponents. The lesson drawn was clear: attack decisively and victory would follow. But those wars had been fought before the full maturation of industrial firepower. By 1914, the battlefield had changed irrevocably. The machine gun, once unreliable and cumbersome, had evolved into a robust defensive weapon. A handful of well-positioned gunners could halt entire battalions. Artillery had grown more powerful, more accurate, and more destructive. High-explosive shells could obliterate formations before they ever saw the enemy. Rifles fired faster, farther, and more precisely. The balance between offense and defense had shifted, but few fully grasped how far. War planning reflected this dangerous misunderstanding. Germany's Schlieffen Plan envisioned a rapid march through Belgium, a sweeping envelopment that would crush France in weeks. France's Plan 17 emphasized aggressive attacks to reclaim lost territory. Both plans relied on speed, coordination, and morale overpowering resistance. They assumed movement would be possible. When war came in August 1914, it came with breathtaking speed. Mobilization timetables clicked into place. Trains carried soldiers to the front in endless waves. Across Europe, young men marched with confidence, many believing they were participating in a short, decisive struggle. Reality arrived in gunfire. In Belgium and northern France, German armies advanced, but at enormous cost. French offensives collapsed under machine gun fire. British units, highly trained but vastly outnumbered, inflicted damage yet were forced to retreat. Casualties mounted at a pace unseen in previous wars. Within weeks, it became clear that frontal assaults against prepared positions were catastrophically expensive. And so, instinctively, soldiers began to dig. At first, these were shallow scrapes, temporary shelters against rifle fire and shrapnel. But as engagements repeated, these scrapes deepened. Earth was piled higher. Walls were reinforced. Over time, isolated trenches connected into lines. Lines evolved into systems. This was not a deliberate strategic decision. It was survival. Whenever troops paused, even briefly, they dug. Whenever they advanced, they dug again. The ground itself became the most reliable protection available. Helmets and uniforms could not stop shells. Courage could not halt bullets. Only earth could. By late 1914, after the so-called race to the sea, both sides attempted to outflank one another northward. Each attempt failed. Every open flank was sealed with new trenches. Eventually there was nowhere left to maneuver. The front solidified. What emerged was unprecedented. A continuous fortified line stretching hundreds of miles. No previous war had produced anything like it. Movement, the foundation of traditional warfare, vanished almost entirely. High command faced a dilemma with no clear solution. Defensive positions were enormously strong. Attacking them without overwhelming superiority was suicidal. Yet remaining on the defensive ceded initiative to the enemy. Political leaders demanded progress. Allies demanded pressure on other fronts. Doing nothing was not an option. The result was a strategic deadlock. Attempts to break the stalemate relied heavily on artillery. If guns could destroy enemy trenches, attacks might succeed. Massive bombardments were planned, sometimes lasting days or weeks, intended to pulverize defenses before infantry advanced. But technology again betrayed expectations. Artillery often failed to cut barbed wire. Trenches collapsed but were quickly repaired. Deep dugouts protected defenders from shellfire. When bombardments ended, surviving machine gunners emerged and opened fire on advancing troops. The cycle repeated itself relentlessly. Behind the front lines, entire societies reorganized around this new form of warfare. Industrial output became as important as battlefield tactics. Ammunition shortages could decide campaigns. Manpower reserves determined how long an army could endure losses. The war transformed from a contest of generals into a test of nations. And the trenches reflected this transformation. They were not static ditches. They evolved constantly. Early trenches were crude and deadly in their own way, poorly drained, prone to collapse, exposed to the elements. Over time, experience forced improvements. Drainage systems were added. Duckboards laid over mud. Dugouts reinforced with timber and steel. Trenches became semi-permanent structures, sometimes resembling underground fortresses. Life within them was governed by routine and tension. Soldiers rotated between frontline duty, support positions, and brief periods of rest. Even rest, however, was relative. Artillery reached far behind the lines. No place was truly safe. The psychological impact was profound. Men lived under constant threat, never knowing when the next shell would fall. They adapted, learned to read the sound of incoming fire, learned when to take cover and when to remain still. Fear became a constant companion, not paralyzing but exhausting. Commanders, meanwhile, faced impossible choices. To attack was to sacrifice men. To remain passive risked defeat through attrition. Innovations were attempted: mining under enemy trenches, gas attacks, creeping barrages. Each offered temporary advantage, soon countered by the enemy. The trenches absorbed everything. They absorbed shells. They absorbed bodies. They absorbed hope. Yet they also preserved armies from annihilation. In earlier wars, defeat often meant collapse. In trench warfare, even catastrophic losses could be absorbed, replaced, endured. The line might bend, but it rarely broke. This endurance reshaped strategic thinking. Why commanders believed the trenches could be overcome. By 1915, the trenches were no longer an accident of war. They were accepted reality. Yet acceptance did not mean resignation. Across Europe, generals on both sides remained convinced that trench warfare was temporary, that with the correct plan, the correct weapon, or the correct concentration of force, the deadlock could be shattered. The war, they believed, could still be won through a decisive breakthrough. This belief was not blind optimism. It was rooted in logic, precedent, and pressure. Modern armies could not exist indefinitely in stalemate. Nations were bleeding men, material, and morale. Political leaders demanded results. Civilian populations, kept in the dark but sensing the scale of sacrifice, expected progress. High command had to promise victory, even if the path to it was uncertain. The prevailing solution was simple in theory. Break the enemy trench line. Exploit the gap. Restore movement to the battlefield. Everything that followed was designed to serve this goal. Military planners analyzed the trench system in detail. They mapped enemy positions, counted trench lines, studied defensive layouts. They concluded that the problem was not attack itself, but insufficient preparation. If artillery could destroy the trenches, infantry could advance safely. Thus emerged the doctrine of the massive bombardment. Artillery was elevated from a supporting role to the central instrument of victory. Guns were gathered in unprecedented numbers. Shell production became a national priority. Entire offensives were planned around days, or even weeks, of continuous shelling. The promise was compelling. Enemy trenches would be obliterated. Barbed wire would be cut. Defenders would be killed, buried, or too stunned to resist. Then, when the guns fell silent, infantry would advance and occupy what remained. On paper it was flawless. In practice it was deeply flawed. Early bombardments revealed uncomfortable truths. Artillery accuracy was limited. Shells often landed short or long. Barbed wire proved stubbornly resilient. Deep dugouts protected defenders from even the heaviest shellfire. Yet commanders persisted. If short bombardments failed, longer ones would succeed. If thousands of shells were not enough, millions would be used. Firepower, it was believed, could compensate for any obstacle. This belief was reinforced by technology itself. Industrial capacity gave armies confidence that no problem was insoluble. New weapons appeared constantly: heavier guns, more lethal shells, improved fuses. Science and engineering were expected to deliver victory. Trench warfare became a technical challenge to be solved. Beyond artillery, planners explored other methods of breakthrough. Mining operations were conducted beneath enemy trenches. Tunnels were dug in secret, packed with explosives, and detonated beneath opposing positions. Entire sections of front vanished in towering explosions, leaving massive craters. For brief moments, these attacks succeeded. But they were local, limited, and difficult to exploit. The enemy adapted, countermined, reinforced, and sealed breaches before movement could be restored. Chemical weapons followed. Poison gas was introduced as a means of bypassing trenches entirely. Clouds of chlorine, phosgene, and later mustard gas drifted across no man's land, seeping into dugouts and forcing defenders to flee or suffocate. Gas offered terror, but not decision. Weather made it unreliable. Gas masks reduced its effectiveness. And soon, both sides possessed the same weapons, turning gas warfare into another grim stalemate. Still, the belief endured: the next offensive would succeed. Commanders promised that sacrifices would not be repeated endlessly, that each attack brought lessons learned, improvements made. New tactics were developed: creeping barrages, coordinated infantry waves, timed advances. The war became a laboratory of destruction. Soldiers were trained to follow artillery fire closely, advancing just behind a moving curtain of explosions. If timed perfectly, defenders would still be sheltering when attackers arrived. Timing, however, was unforgiving. Too slow and defenders recovered. Too fast and advancing troops were caught by their own artillery. Small errors produced catastrophic results. Yet the promise of breakthrough justified continued attempts. Trench warfare also reshaped unit identity. Specialized formations emerged: engineers, bombers, trench raiders. Raids were conducted at night to gather intelligence, destroy positions, and maintain offensive spirit. These actions rarely changed the strategic picture, but they sustained the belief that initiative had not been lost. Above all, commanders feared inertia. To accept permanent trench warfare was to admit failure, not only of strategy but of leadership. Offensive doctrine was deeply embedded in military culture. To abandon it was unthinkable. So plans were drawn, revised, and drawn again. Maps filled with arrows pointing forward. Timetables promised advances measured in miles. Orders spoke of objectives that rarely survived first contact with reality. The men in the trenches heard these promises secondhand. They knew what attacks meant. They had seen previous assaults dissolve into chaos and death. Yet they also understood their position. Refusal was not an option. Obedience was survival, for oneself and for the men beside you. Thus, trench warfare persisted not because it was accepted as ideal, but because no alternative had proven viable. The battlefield had evolved faster than doctrine. Commanders were forced to improvise within a system they barely understood, using tools that were still being invented. And so, again and again, armies prepared for the next great offensive. The guns were aligned. The shells stockpiled. The orders written. What followed, when plans met reality, would define trench warfare more than any theory ever could. When the trenches were tested by fire. The moment an offensive begins in trench warfare is unmistakable. It starts with sound. A deep, rolling thunder that vibrates through the ground itself. Artillery batteries open fire in unison, hundreds, sometimes thousands, of guns releasing their shells toward the enemy line. The air fills with smoke, dust, and the metallic scream of incoming rounds. The earth shudders, trench walls collapse, and men press themselves against mud and timber, waiting. This is the opening act of every major trench assault. 4 days, sometimes weeks, the bombardment continues. The intent is absolute destruction. Enemy trenches are mapped, measured, and targeted relentlessly. Commanders believe that nothing living can survive such punishment. The defenders, buried underground, endure a different reality. Deep dugouts shake but hold. Men count the seconds between impacts. Dust fills their lungs. The noise is constant, so loud it erases thought. Some emerge shaken but alive. Others do not emerge at all. Then suddenly the guns stop. Silence spreads across the front, broken only by the crackle of small fires and the cries of the wounded. For attacking troops, this silence signals the moment they have been preparing for. Orders are passed along the trench line. Ladders are placed against the parapet. Rifles are checked. Bayonets fixed. At a whistle's blow, men climb out of the trench. They emerge into no man's land, advancing toward what they have been told is a shattered enemy position. The ground before them is unrecognizable, churned into craters, stripped of vegetation, littered with debris and bodies from earlier battles. Almost immediately, the illusion collapses. Machine guns open fire. From positions thought destroyed, defenders rise and man their weapons. Belts of ammunition feed relentlessly. Lines of advancing infantry begin to falter, then break. Men fall in clusters. Others seek shelter in shell holes, pinned down by fire they cannot answer. The gap between expectation and reality is brutal. Artillery has not destroyed the trench system. Barbed wire remains intact in places, forcing men to bunch together under fire. Communication breaks down as officers are killed. The carefully planned advance dissolves into confusion. This pattern repeats itself across the front. At Neuve Chapelle, at Loos, at Artois, attacks gain ground briefly, only to stall once artillery support moves forward too slowly or supplies fail to keep pace. Success, when it comes, is fragile and fleeting. The first true lesson of trench warfare is learned here. Breaking into a trench is not the same as breaking through it. Even when attackers reach the enemy line, they face immediate counterattack. Reserve trenches lie behind the front, connected by communication trenches that allow defenders to reinforce rapidly. Attacking troops, exhausted and disorganized, struggle to consolidate gains. Movement, the objective of all planning, remains elusive. Soldiers experience trench warfare's reality in fragments. Moments of terror, confusion, and exhaustion stitched together by long hours of waiting. They learn quickly that courage alone offers no protection. Survival depends on luck, cover, and timing. Commanders, receiving delayed and often inaccurate reports, attempt to react. Orders are issued to push forward, to exploit success, to hold captured ground at all costs. But the battlefield resists control. Trench warfare exposes the limits of command. Telephones are cut by shellfire. Runners are killed crossing open ground. Decisions made miles behind the lines arrive too late or not at all. Units fight in isolation, reacting to immediate threats rather than grand strategy. This is first contact, not between armies but between theory and reality. Each offensive ends with grim arithmetic. Ground gained is measured in yards. Casualties are counted in thousands. The trenches shift slightly, then stabilize again. Yet despite failure, these early engagements shape future operations. Commanders begin to recognize patterns. They learn that surprise matters. That coordination between artillery and infantry must be precise. That attacking everywhere at once dilutes effectiveness. That reserves must be positioned to exploit success instantly. These lessons, however, are learned at extraordinary cost. For the men who survive, trench warfare loses any remaining illusions. They understand now that attacks are not decisive blows, but calculated risks with uncertain outcomes. Morale adapts, not through optimism but through acceptance. This acceptance becomes one of trench warfare's defining features. Men stop asking when the war will end. They focus instead on the next task, the next watch, the next ration. The future shrinks to manageable increments. In this way, trench warfare conditions the human mind as much as the human body. The first deployments reveal something else as well. Trench warfare is not static. It is dynamic in its own brutal way. Positions change hands repeatedly. New trenches are dug. Old ones abandoned. The front breathes, slowly, almost imperceptibly. But always it returns to stalemate. As offensives fail, pressure increases to achieve results. The scale of attacks grows. More guns. More men. More shells. The belief persists that sheer force will succeed where careful planning has failed. What follows is escalation. The war enters its most destructive phase, not because leaders are ignorant but because they believe they are close. That the next assault, refined by experience, will finally deliver the breakthrough they seek. For the soldiers in the trenches, this knowledge offers little comfort. They know that another attack is coming. They do not know when. They only know what it will demand. And so they wait. Where plans collapsed and survival took over. By the middle years of the war, trench warfare had stripped away all remaining illusions. What remained was reality, unforgiving, mechanical, and indifferent to intention. Offensives no longer began with excitement or expectation among the men ordered to fight them. They began with resignation. Soldiers understood that success was rare, that failure was common, and that survival depended less on courage than on chance. The trenches themselves bore the marks of this understanding. They were no longer rough ditches hastily cut into the ground. They had become complex, evolving structures shaped by constant fire and hard experience. Parapets were reinforced. Traverses were added to limit blast damage. Dugouts were driven deeper into the earth, sometimes several meters below the surface. Every improvement responded to a specific threat. Artillery forced depth. Machine guns forced cover. Gas forced sealed spaces. Trench warfare was an arms race fought underground. Yet no amount of engineering could eliminate chaos. Rain turned trenches into canals of mud. Walls collapsed without warning. Men drowned in shell holes filled with water. Disease spread easily, trench foot, dysentery, respiratory infections. The environment itself became an enemy. Mistakes were constant and often fatal. Artillery barrages fell short, killing friendly troops. Orders were misunderstood or arrived too late. Units lost direction in smoke and darkness. Officers were killed early in attacks, leaving men leaderless in open ground. The battlefield punished precision and rewarded randomness. Even success carried danger. When attackers captured an enemy trench, they inherited its vulnerabilities. The position was often poorly oriented for defense, exposed to fire from flanking positions. Communication lines were severed. Supplies lagged behind. Counterattacks came swiftly. Holding ground could be as deadly as taking it. The language of war changed accordingly. Reports no longer spoke of sweeping victories. They spoke of holding on, of maintaining pressure, of acceptable losses. Entire divisions were expended to achieve objectives that would have seemed insignificant before the war. Trench warfare normalized the unacceptable. Casualty lists lengthened, then blurred into abstraction. Thousands killed in a single day became a statistic. The emotional weight of loss was carried by those who returned, not by those who planned. This disconnect deepened resentment. Soldiers at the front often believed they were being sacrificed for minimal gain. Commanders, in turn, believed that pressure must be maintained at all costs. To pause was to give the enemy time to recover, to reinforce, to strengthen defenses. Thus the cycle continued. One offensive bled into the next. Battles that were supposed to end the war merely reshaped the front. The Somme, Verdun, Passchendaele, names that became synonymous with endurance and suffering, each followed similar patterns. Heavy bombardment. Infantry advance. Initial gains. Stalling. Counterattack. Stalemate. The scale of destruction increased, but the outcome remained the same. Trench warfare revealed a deeper truth about industrialized conflict. Efficiency in killing did not translate into efficiency in winning. Weapons were extraordinarily effective at destroying human life. They were far less effective at achieving strategic decision. This reality forced armies into a grim logic of attrition. If the enemy could not be outmaneuvered, he could be exhausted. If trenches could not be bypassed, they could be attacked repeatedly until resistance collapsed. Victory became a matter of endurance rather than brilliance. For soldiers, this meant something terrifyingly simple. They were not expected to win the war. They were expected to endure it longer than the enemy. This expectation weighed heavily on morale. Men learned to suppress emotion. They avoided forming attachments when possible. They joked darkly, not out of humor but as a shield against despair. Letters home were censored and cautious, hiding the worst truths. Yet cracks appeared. Shell shock, what would later be recognized as psychological trauma, spread through the ranks. Men became unresponsive, disoriented, unable to function under fire. At the time, such conditions were poorly understood and often punished rather than treated. The mental cost of trench warfare was enormous. And still the system persisted. Because, despite everything, trench warfare worked, at least in the narrowest military sense. It prevented collapse. It allowed armies to absorb punishment that would have destroyed them in earlier wars. It maintained coherent fronts under unprecedented strain. This duality lay at the heart of trench warfare's tragedy. It was both a failure and a necessity. A disaster and a solution. The trenches did not exist because leaders were indifferent to suffering. They existed because the alternatives seemed worse, or simply impossible. As the war dragged on, however, the human cost became impossible to ignore. Entire generations were consumed. Society strained under the burden of endless casualties. Pressure mounted for change. If trench warfare could not be abandoned, perhaps it could be transformed. New methods were needed, new ways to fight that acknowledged reality without surrendering to it. That search would lead armies to look not only at weapons and tactics, but at the human beings who endured the trenches every day. In the next part, the focus shifts downward, from strategy and failure to the individual soldier, whose experience defined trench warfare more than any plan ever could. Fear, endurance, and the psychology of the trenches. Trench warfare was not experienced as a sequence of battles. It was experienced as time. Long stretches of waiting, punctuated by moments of overwhelming violence. Days without action followed by minutes that decided life or death. For the men who lived in the trenches, the war was not a continuous fight, it was an unrelenting psychological burden. Fear was constant. Not the sharp fear of sudden danger, but a slow, grinding awareness that death could arrive at any moment. A random shell. A sniper's bullet. A collapsing trench wall. There was no safe pattern, no predictable rhythm. Men learned to live inside uncertainty. The soundscape of the trenches became intimately familiar. The distant thud of outgoing artillery. The rising whistle of incoming shells. The dull crash of impact. Soldiers learned to judge distance and danger by ear alone. Survival depended on these instincts. Sleep was fragmented and shallow. Men slept when they could, where they could, on damp boards against trench walls, sometimes standing upright. Shelling often came at night, denying rest when it was most needed. Fatigue accumulated slowly, eroding concentration and judgment. Discipline filled the gaps left by exhaustion. Daily routines were enforced not only for order but for sanity. Stand to at dawn and dusk. Trench maintenance. Weapon cleaning. Sentry duty. These tasks provided structure in an environment that otherwise dissolved meaning. Yet beneath routine, stress accumulated. The trenches confined men physically and mentally. Space was limited. Privacy non-existent. The presence of death was constant, sometimes just inches away, when bodies lay unburied in the trench walls or no man's land. Rats thrived in this environment. Large, aggressive, unafraid of humans. They fed on food scraps and corpses alike. Lice infested clothing, spreading disease and misery. Hygiene was impossible to maintain. The body suffered. Feet swelled and rotted from constant moisture. Hands cracked and bled. Respiratory illnesses spread in damp air. Medical care, though improving, was often overwhelmed by sheer numbers. But it was the mind that bore the greatest strain. Shell shock emerged as one of trench warfare's most devastating legacies. Men exposed to prolonged bombardment developed tremors, paralysis, loss of speech, and emotional numbness. At the time, these symptoms were often interpreted as weakness or cowardice. Some soldiers were punished. Others were returned to the line. Understanding lagged behind experience. Fear was not the only emotion. There was boredom, deep, oppressive boredom that dulled awareness and made danger feel unreal. There was anger, often directed upward at commanders or backward at civilians who could not understand. There was grief, quietly endured as comrades disappeared. Yet there was also camaraderie. Shared suffering created bonds that transcended background and nationality. Men relied on each other absolutely. Survival was collective. One man's alertness protected another's life. Trust became essential. This bond sustained morale more than ideology ever could. Letters from home were lifelines. They connected soldiers to a world that felt increasingly distant and unreal. Many wrote carefully, shielding loved ones from the truth. Some stopped writing altogether, unable to explain what they were living through. Religion, superstition, and ritual filled the gaps left by uncertainty. Men carried charms. They avoided routines believed to bring bad luck. Small beliefs offered a sense of control where none existed. Attacks, when they came, were almost a relief. Not because they were welcomed, but because they broke the monotony. Action replaced waiting. Fear became focused. Some men reported feeling strangely calm once the advance began. This calm rarely lasted. As soon as the attack ended, successfully or not, the waiting returned. And with it, reflection. Memory. Loss. The trench was not just a defensive structure. It was a psychological environment that reshaped identity. Men became older than their years. Humor darkened. Empathy narrowed. Yet many endured. They adapted in ways that surprised even themselves. The human capacity to normalize the unbearable was fully exposed. What would have seemed impossible before the war became routine within it. This endurance, however, came at a cost that would not be fully understood until long after the guns fell silent. Trench warfare did not end when soldiers left the front. For many, it followed them home, into dreams, habits, silences. The human experience of trench warfare cannot be separated from its military logic. The system functioned only because men endured what should have been unendurable. In the next part, the perspective shifts outward, to the enemy on the opposite side of no man's land, revealing that the same suffering, fear, and adaptation existed on both sides of the trenches. Two sides of the same trench. Across no man's land, beyond the torn wire and shattered ground, another trench mirrors the first. Its shape is different. Its uniforms are different. Its language is different. But the experience is the same. Trench warfare did not belong to one army or one nation. It was a shared condition imposed equally on enemies who rarely saw one another's faces. Each side believed the other possessed advantages, better guns, stronger defenses, superior morale. In reality, both were trapped by the same system. German soldiers on the Western Front entered the trenches early in the war, often before their opponents. Their doctrine initially emphasized rapid movement, but when momentum stalled, they adapted quickly to defense. German engineers built deep, reinforced dugouts, sometimes several stories underground, protected by concrete and timber. These positions reflected expectation. German command anticipated prolonged warfare. Their trenches were designed to be held, not abandoned. Defensive depth became a guiding principle. Multiple trench lines, strong points, and fallback positions. From the opposite side, these defenses appeared formidable and almost impenetrable. French and British soldiers facing them believed the enemy lived more comfortably, better protected from shellfire. German soldiers, in turn, believed the same of Allied positions. Each side imagined the other endured less hardship. Both were wrong. German trenches flooded. Dugouts collapsed. Artillery reached everywhere. Rations were limited. Leave was rare. The same rats, lice, and disease thrived. And the same fear persisted. Enemy soldiers were not faceless threats to those in the trenches. They were unseen presences, audible but distant. Voices carried across the lines at night. Songs were heard. Shouts echoed. Sometimes insults. Sometimes silence. In rare moments, humanity surfaced. During quiet periods, informal truces occurred. Men refrained from shooting those repairing trenches or collecting wounded. On certain holidays, weapons fell silent altogether. These moments were fragile and unofficial, but they revealed an unspoken truth. The enemy was enduring the same war. High command viewed such behavior with suspicion. Fraternization threatened discipline and the narrative of necessary hostility. Orders were issued to prevent it. The system required separation, not only physically but psychologically. Trench warfare depended on distance. The farther the enemy was reduced to an abstraction, the easier it was to continue. Artillery crews rarely saw what their shells did. Infantry fired into smoke and darkness. Killing became impersonal by design. Yet soldiers sometimes encountered the enemy directly. Raids brought close combat. Patrols collided in the dark. In these moments, the abstraction vanished. War became immediate, personal, and brutal. Bayonets, grenades, and hand-to-hand fighting replaced long-range fire. These encounters left lasting impressions. Men remembered faces, accents, fear mirrored in another's eyes. Such moments haunted veterans precisely because they broke the illusion that trench warfare maintained. From a strategic perspective, enemy adaptation was constant. Each innovation was quickly countered. New artillery techniques were met with deeper dugouts. Gas attacks prompted improved masks. Raids led to better wire and listening posts. Nothing remained effective for long. This mutual adaptation reinforced stalemate. Neither side could achieve decisive superiority for extended periods. Gains were temporary. Advantages fleeting. Trench warfare became a dialogue of destruction. Action, reaction, counteraction. Understanding the enemy's experience complicates judgment. Trench warfare was not imposed unilaterally. It was sustained by mutual necessity. Each side dug because the other did. Each attacked because the other would recover if left alone. The system fed itself. For soldiers on both sides, the enemy became less a villain and more a force of nature. Dangerous, unpredictable, ever-present. Hatred existed, but it was often overshadowed by exhaustion. The shared suffering did not end the war, but it revealed its symmetry. In the next part, attention turns to how this symmetry was finally challenged, not by abandoning trench warfare outright, but by adapting it, reshaping it, and slowly finding ways to move beyond it. How armies learned to fight the trenches. By 1916, it was clear that trench warfare would not be broken by brute force alone. The repeated cycle of bombardment and assault had proven its limits. Casualties mounted, but decisive results remained elusive. If the war was to be won, the trench system itself had to be understood, and then overcome, not abandoned but transformed. This realization marked a turning point. Commanders began to accept that traditional methods were insufficient. Victory would require integration of weapons, timing, communication, and movement. Trench warfare forced armies to innovate under pressure, accelerating change at a pace never before seen. Artillery doctrine evolved first. Rather than simply destroying enemy positions, artillery was now used to shape the battlefield. The creeping barrage became central, a moving wall of fire designed to advance just ahead of attacking infantry. Its purpose was suppression, not annihilation. Defenders were forced to remain in cover. Machine gun crews could not man their weapons. When timed correctly, infantry arrived before defenders could react. Timing, however, was everything. Barrage schedules were precise, unforgiving. Infantry trained extensively to keep pace. Watches were synchronized. Signals refined. Errors were still deadly, but success, when achieved, demonstrated that trenches could be penetrated. Coordination expanded beyond artillery. Infantry tactics changed dramatically. Attacks were no longer conducted in massed waves alone. Smaller units were given specific objectives. Fire and movement replaced simple advance. Grenades, light machine guns, and trench mortars gave squads organic firepower. The soldier was no longer just a rifleman. He was part of a system. Engineering played a critical role. Sappers built jumping-off trenches closer to enemy lines. Tunnels allowed troops to assemble under cover. Bridges were prepared to cross trenches quickly. The battlefield was reshaped deliberately, rather than endured passively. Air power entered the equation. Aircraft, once novelties, became tools of reconnaissance and coordination. Observation planes corrected artillery fire. Photographs revealed enemy trench layouts in detail. Control of the air, while limited, influenced ground operations. Perhaps the most significant adaptation came in steel. The tank emerged as a response to trench warfare's central problem: crossing open ground under fire. Early models were slow, unreliable, and mechanically fragile. But they could cross trenches, crush wire, and provide mobile firepower. At first, tanks offered surprise more than effectiveness. But surprise mattered. At Cambrai in 1917, tanks were used in large numbers without prolonged bombardment. The attack achieved deep penetration, demonstrating that mobility could be restored, even if temporarily. Trench warfare was no longer absolute. Defenders adapted quickly. Anti-tank weapons appeared. Tactics adjusted. But the direction of change was irreversible. Combined arms, infantry, artillery, armor, and air, began to replace isolated assaults. The nature of trench warfare shifted. It became less static, more fluid. Front lines bent more frequently. Breakthroughs, though still costly, became possible. The war of position began, slowly, to give way to a war of movement. Yet this adaptation did not erase suffering. New methods still relied on massive firepower. Casualties remained high. Success still demanded endurance. Innovation did not humanize the war, it optimized it. For soldiers, adaptation meant constant retraining. They learned new weapons, new signals, new roles. The pace of change added to fatigue. But it also offered hope, that the trench was no longer an inescapable fate. By the final year of the war, this hope began to materialize. Coordinated offensives, supported by tanks and aircraft, pushed the front back decisively. The trench system, once dominant, began to collapse under sustained pressure. But its influence did not disappear. Trench warfare had reshaped military thinking permanently. Even as armies moved again, they did so with lessons learned underground, about defense, coordination, and the human cost of modern war. In the next part, attention turns to outcomes, not only in terms of territory gained or lost, but in terms of what trench warfare ultimately achieved and at what cost. What trench warfare achieved, and what it destroyed. By 1918, the trenches that had once defined the Western Front began to lose their grip. The lines still existed. The scars in the earth remained. But the logic that sustained them was breaking down. Combined arms, improved coordination, and overwhelming material superiority finally restored movement to the battlefield. The end came not with a single decisive blow, but with collapse. Germany, exhausted by years of attrition, blockade, and relentless pressure, could no longer sustain the war. Its final offensives failed to achieve decision. Allied counterattacks, supported by tanks, aircraft, and refined artillery tactics, pushed steadily forward. Trench lines were abandoned, not because they had failed tactically, but because the strategic situation had become untenable. When the armistice was signed in November 1918, the battlefield fell silent. The trenches emptied. The guns stopped. But the consequences of trench warfare did not end with the war itself. They spread outward, into societies, institutions, and memory. From a purely military perspective, trench warfare had achieved its narrow objective. It prevented sudden collapse. It preserved armies under unprecedented firepower. It allowed nations to sustain total war for 4 years. In earlier conflicts, such losses would have shattered forces outright. In the First World War, trench systems absorbed punishment that would otherwise have been decisive. But this endurance came at extraordinary cost. The human toll was staggering. Millions were killed. Millions more wounded. Entire generations were scarred, physically and psychologically. Nations lost not only soldiers but future leaders, workers, and families. Trench warfare transformed loss into routine. The scale of casualties reshaped how societies understood death. Mourning became collective. Memorials rose in every town and village. Absence became a permanent feature of post-war life. Economically, the consequences were equally profound. Total war drained national treasuries. Infrastructure was devastated. Agricultural land was poisoned and ruined. Recovery would take decades. For some regions, it never fully came. Politically, trench warfare destabilized empires. The war it sustained destroyed the old order. Monarchies fell. Revolutions erupted. Borders were redrawn under pressure from populations exhausted by sacrifice. The world that emerged from the trenches was fundamentally altered. Psychologically, the impact was lasting and complex. Veterans returned carrying experiences that defied explanation. Many struggled to reintegrate into civilian life. Silence became common. Understanding was rare. The term shell shock entered public consciousness, marking a shift in how trauma was perceived, though treatment lagged behind recognition. Culturally, trench warfare reshaped how war itself was imagined. Romantic visions of battle did not survive the trenches. Literature, art, and memory turned darker, more skeptical. War was no longer framed as glory, it was framed as loss. Yet even here the picture is not simple. Trench warfare did not occur because leaders desired suffering. It occurred because industrialized firepower made alternatives unworkable. The system that caused so much destruction also prevented even greater catastrophe in certain contexts. Had armies refused to dig in, casualties might have been even higher. Rapid breakthroughs could have led to total collapse, occupation, and prolonged civil suffering. The trench, grim as it was, imposed limits on destruction, even as it multiplied it. This contradiction lies at the heart of trench warfare's legacy. It was not a failure of courage. It was not merely a failure of imagination. It was the product of a world unprepared for the consequences of its own power. Modern warfare was born in the trenches, not as theory but as lived reality. Everything that followed in the 20th century carried their imprint: combined arms doctrine, defensive depth, psychological awareness, and the recognition that technology changes war faster than institutions can adapt. As the soldiers left the trenches behind, they carried those lessons with them, whether they wished to or not. The war was over. But trench warfare had already reshaped history. In the final part, attention turns to judgment, not moral outrage or justification but reflection. What ultimately does trench warfare mean? What lessons endure? And how should it be remembered? The enduring impact of trench warfare. Trench warfare left a mark far deeper than the scars in Europe's fields. Its legacy is measured not only in the ground churned by shells, but in the lives it shaped, the institutions it transformed, and the lessons it imposed on generations of soldiers, leaders, and civilians. At its core, trench warfare revealed the limits of human agency in modern conflict. Plans, strategy, and doctrine, however brilliant, were constantly challenged by industrial firepower. Technology had evolved faster than tactics, producing conditions in which survival often outweighed success, and endurance became a measure of effectiveness. Yet this endurance came at staggering cost. Millions of lives were lost. Millions more were permanently wounded, physically and psychologically. Entire communities mourned. Societies struggled to comprehend the scale of destruction. And yet, paradoxically, the trenches also preserved armies that might otherwise have been annihilated. They created a framework in which nations could continue fighting under conditions that would have broken earlier generations. Trench warfare also left a profound imprint on military thought. The stalemate forced armies to innovate. Combined arms tactics, creeping barrages, the integration of air power, tanks, and engineers. Defensive depth, previously undervalued, became central to operational planning. Logistics, communication, and reconnaissance were elevated to strategic importance. Future conflicts would inherit these lessons, applied more systematically in ways that often mitigated, but did not eliminate, the human cost. The psychological legacy was equally significant. Trench warfare introduced modern armies to the realities of mass trauma. Shell shock, prolonged stress, and cumulative psychological strain demanded new approaches to care and recognition. The experience of enduring constant danger, boredom, and loss shaped a generation, influencing how nations understood mental health, duty, and resilience. Culturally, the war changed perception of heroism and sacrifice. Romantic notions of combat were replaced by grim realism. Literature, art, and film memorialized endurance, loss, and human courage in ways that resonated far beyond the battlefield. The trenches also carried lessons about the interaction between society and warfare. Industrialized nations could mobilize unprecedented resources, but this capability demanded societal engagement, conscription, rationing, labor mobilization, and political sacrifice. The war blurred boundaries between military and civilian life, demonstrating that modern conflict encompassed entire nations. Finally, trench warfare reminds history of the complex morality of necessity. It was not chosen for cruelty, nor was it merely incompetence. It was, in many ways, a response to a technological and tactical dilemma. Commanders faced choices with no fully safe options. Societies demanded results. Soldiers needed protection. The trenches were simultaneously the worst possible solution and the only one available under the circumstances. In the end, the legacy of trench warfare is not contained in victories or defeats, but in understanding. It is a testament to human resilience under extreme conditions. It is a lesson in adaptation, ingenuity, and endurance. It is a warning about the consequences of technological advancement outpacing human foresight. And it is a reminder that, in war, survival and suffering are often inseparable. As generations reflect on the First World War, the trenches remain emblematic. They are the physical embodiment of a human disaster and a military necessity intertwined, a paradox that continues to define how modern war is studied, remembered, and understood. The men who lived and died within the trenches left behind more than memory. They left insight, an unflinching record of what happens when industrialized violence meets human endurance, and what it truly costs to fight a war that cannot be won quickly, yet cannot be surrendered. Trench warfare, in all its brutality and complexity, is the defining symbol of the First World War. A necessary evil, a human disaster, and a teacher whose lessons continue to echo across generations.